May 17th, 1945. A gray, windy afternoon at New York Harbor. A ship groaned under the weight of women in drab uniforms, hair tied back, eyes hollow from weeks of hunger and fear. They had crossed the ocean expecting insults, cold cells, and the harsh rule of men. Instead, they stepped onto a pier ruled by women. Women in overalls, carrying clipboards, giving orders that even soldiers obeyed. The sound of laughter, the smell of fresh coffee, and the confident click of heels hit them like a shock they could not name. Every glance, every gesture seemed impossible, like a secret they were not supposed to see. This was not a performance, not a trick. It was ordinary life, and it tore apart everything they had been taught to believe. Watch closely, because what they saw that day would haunt them forever and change how they saw themselves. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay until the end to see the full story. May 17th, 1945. The gray water of New York Harbor rolled against the sides of the ship as it slowed toward the pier. For weeks, the German women on board had slept in hammocks that swayed with the sea, counting each day with dread. Most had been nurses, typists, and volunteers for the German army. They were now prisoners of war, unsure what waited for them in America. Rumors whispered through the cargo hold, stories of harsh camps, punishment, and shame. The women expected anger. They expected to be treated as enemies, but what they saw on the pier left them silent. The harbor was alive with sound, cranes groaning, gulls circling, trucks grinding their gears, the smell of oil mixed with roasted coffee coming from somewhere on shore. American soldiers shouted orders, but the first faces the women noticed were not men at all. Women moved among the lines of guards, carrying papers, checking lists, giving directions. Some wore uniforms, others wore trousers rolled at the ankle, hair tied back under caps. One woman lifted a clipboard and called out names in a strong voice. The prisoners looked at each other, confused. "Are those secretaries?" one whispered. "No," another said, staring. "They are in charge." For the German women, this was the first wound to certainty. In their world, authority had always sounded male. Deep voices, sharp commands. Women were meant to obey, to serve quietly behind the lines. But here, even at a prisoner's dock, women gave orders. The American sun felt warmer than any light they had known in months. They squinted as they were counted, tagged, and loaded into trucks, yet their minds stayed on what they had seen. The women with clipboards, moving with confidence, a single sentence repeated in many of their letters later. "It was the first time we saw women unafraid." As the trucks pulled away from the pier, another sight deepened the shock. Along the streets of the harbor town, women walked beside men, laughing, carrying bags, some pushing baby strollers while others drove cars. Posters showed a smiling woman in overalls with rolled sleeves. "We can do it!" The image, known later as Rosie the Riveter, stared from a wall as the convoy passed. Inside the truck, a woman named Liesel pressed her hand to the glass. "They let her show her arms," she whispered, half in wonder, half in disbelief. "In Germany, they would call that shameful." The driver turned the radio louder. Jazz music filled the air, brass, piano, drum, bright and free. It was unlike the marching songs they had known. Each note felt like defiance, wrapped in joy. Even in captivity, the rhythm made something inside them stir. Curiosity, maybe envy. By 1944, more than 6 million American women had worked in factories and farms to support the war. Many replaced men who had gone to fight. They welded planes, packed ammunition, drove trucks, and ran offices. For the first time, women's labor had become the backbone of a nation at war. The prisoners did not know the number then, but they could feel its truth in every direction they looked. At a rest stop on the way inland, a guard opened the truck door and told them to step out for inspection. Across the road, a group of women unloaded crates from another truck. Their hands were calloused. Their laughter carried through the dry air. A young prisoner turned to her companion and murmured, "They work like men and smile." When night came, the convoy stopped at a rail yard. The women were given rations, white bread, soup, and an apple each. The meal was simple but clean. For months they had eaten little more than watery broth. They hesitated before touching the food. A Red Cross nurse, another woman, handed out spoons with a gentle smile. "Eat," she said. "You're safe now." It was a small gesture, but it broke through layers of fear. Safety had not been a word they trusted before. In that moment, surrounded by strangers who spoke a different language, they realized that captivity in America might not be what they expected. As the train whistles echoed through the yard and stars settled above the dark hills, one of them wrote in her diary, I thought freedom belonged only to men, but here, even their women stand free. The train began to move, its iron rhythm steady against the tracks. Through narrow windows, the prisoners watched the lights of small towns pass. Shops, diners, and silhouettes of people walking unafraid in the night. The paradox deepened with every mile. They were prisoners, yet everywhere they looked, they saw a freedom larger than any empire. But this was only the beginning. The convoy rolled into a military processing center somewhere in the Midwest. It was late afternoon, and the heat shimmered off the gravel road. The trucks stopped in front of a long white building with tall windows and a row of flags fluttering above the gate. The prisoners stepped down, lined up, and waited for instructions. Most expected the same kind of discipline they had seen in Germany. Harsh orders, boots striking the ground, the constant presence of male guards. Instead, the first person they saw at the registration table was a woman. She wore a khaki uniform, a small cap tilted neatly over short hair, and a silver pen clipped to her pocket. Her name tag read, Corporal Mary Henley. She looked directly at the women as she spoke, her tone firm but calm. "Welcome to the processing camp," she said. "You'll be registered, examined, and assigned barracks. Follow the lines and keep your cards ready." The sound of her voice was steady, professional. No shouting, no threat, just control. For the German prisoners, that calm authority felt unreal. In the world they had known, women rarely gave orders to men, let alone to prisoners. Inside the building, the scene was even more surprising. Women sat behind typewriters, stamping forms, filing records, checking lists. The clatter of keys filled the room like rain. A young prisoner named Ruth stared at the rhythm of the type bars hitting paper. "So many women," she whispered. "They trust them with everything." One guard overheard and smiled. "They keep this place running," he said simply. Further down the hall, another woman in a white uniform waited with medical instruments. She was an army nurse, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked neatly under a cap. The prisoners were inspected for lice and illness, then handed soap and towels. "Next," the nurse called. Her tone was brisk, not cruel. The scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint sweetness of lavender soap. The first pleasant smell the prisoners had known in weeks. For a moment, the women forgot they were captives. They saw efficiency, order, and something even stranger, respect. The American staff addressed them as Miss or Mrs., not as numbers. Their papers listed names, not only identification codes. In Nazi camps, prisoners had become objects. Here, even enemies were handled with bureaucracy and humanity. Outside, a group of women drove military jeeps between the warehouses. Their trousers were stained with dust, their hair tied with scarves. They shouted to each other over the noise of engines, laughing as they worked. The German women watched from the fence, quiet and amazed. "Look at them," one said. "They're not afraid of being seen." Back home, women who took up space like that would have been scolded. They were supposed to be soft-spoken, modest, obedient. But in America, confidence was not a flaw. It was expected. During the war, the United States had trained more than 150,000 women in the Women's Army Corps alone. Thousands more served as pilots, nurses, and mechanics. Across the country, posters and radio shows encouraged women to do their part. It was not only a slogan, it had changed society itself. For the prisoners, every small encounter, a woman officer checking their forms, a nurse giving medicine, a driver shifting gears, became part of a new lesson. Power could wear lipstick, authority could have a gentle voice. At night, in their temporary barracks, the German women whispered about what they had seen. "Did you see her look him in the eyes?" Ruth said softly. "Like equals." Liesl nodded. In our country, even that could be dangerous. The silence that followed was heavy. For years they had been told that women's strength came from silence, from patience, from service to their husbands or the state. Yet here they saw something different. Women respected for what they could do, not for how quietly they obeyed. Outside, crickets sang in the grass. A spotlight swept across the yard. Through the open window came the faint hum of a generator and the click of typewriter keys still tapping in the distance. That sound, work continuing after sunset, seemed to echo the rhythm of a larger world they were just beginning to understand. One of the women wrote in her small notebook, "In America, even the sound of a woman's work has authority." She did not know it yet, but that sentence would stay with her long after the war, carried across the ocean and into a changed Germany. But this moment at the processing camp was only the surface of a deeper realization. Outside the fences, in the towns and fields beyond, the same quiet revolution was happening everywhere. in shops, offices, and homes. What they saw next would challenge not just their expectations, but their entire idea of womanhood. The train that carried the prisoners moved slowly through the heart of America. Each window became a frame, showing a country alive with motion, open fields, small towns, and streets filled with people going about their day. But what caught the women's attention most was not the buildings or the cars. It was the women they saw outside, walking freely, working confidently, and speaking without hesitation. At every station, small crowds gathered to watch the military train pass. Women in bright summer dresses waved to the guard. Some handed baskets of fruit or cigarettes to the American soldiers. For the German prisoners, still wearing faded gray uniforms, it was like watching another world, a place where womanhood looked fearless. As the train slowed near a large town, the prisoners saw rows of stores, cafes, and factories. Through the glass, they noticed a bakery window lined with loaves of white bread. Behind the counter stood a woman, wiping her hands on her apron and giving orders to a young man who carried trays. The women on the train leaned forward, whispering. In Germany, shopkeepers were usually men or elderly widows. Here, a woman managed everything with confidence. Later, when they were unloaded at a nearby holding station, the prisoners caught a closer glimpse of American life. The trucks that drove them through town passed schools, libraries, and a post office where women worked at the desks. In one park, a group of mothers sat on benches, reading newspapers, while their children played. No one looked afraid. No one acted as if they needed permission to speak or decide. Liesel, the same woman who had once whispered about the harbor, stared out the window and said quietly, "They don't walk fast, as if someone is watching them. They walk like they belong." One of the guards, a young American sergeant, overheard and replied kindly, "They do belong. Everyone here does." He said it casually, not realizing that for the prisoners, those words were extraordinary. In their old world, belonging had been a privilege, limited, controlled, and fragile. Inside the camp later that week, a Red Cross volunteer brought in magazines for the prisoners to read. The pages showed women advertising war bonds, modeling clothes, and running small businesses. The caption spoke of the woman's contribution to victory. Each picture felt like a window into a truth they had never been allowed to imagine, that women could be both feminine and powerful, both gentle and respected. By 1944, over 18 million American women held paid jobs, filling nearly 1/3 of the national workforce. They built aircraft, drove ambulances, repaired radios, managed shops, and even reported for newspapers. The war had not only changed the battlefield, it had changed the home front forever. The prisoners often discussed this during their evening walks inside the fenced compound. Some were angry, others inspired. "They think women can do anything," one said bitterly. Another answered, "Maybe that's why they are not afraid." What they saw outside the wire started to challenge what they had been taught since childhood, that obedience was purity, that strength belonged only to men, and that a woman's duty was to serve quietly. America didn't just look different, it felt different. Freedom was visible even in the small thing, a woman adjusting her hat in a shop mirror, laughing loudly in public, driving a car alone down the road. One morning, a supply truck passed near the camp carrying flour, meat, and newspapers. On the side of the truck was painted a slogan, "Women deliver the goods." The German women stood near the fence, staring at the words. They didn't need translation. Inside their barracks that night, the conversation turned quiet. Ruth, who used to teach at a village school before the war, said softly, "If women can run offices and drive trucks, what else can they do when the war ends?" No one answered her, but the question hung in the room like the faint hum of the electric light. The guards dimmed the lamp. Outside, the sound of an American town drifted over the wire. Jazz from a diner radio, a dog barking, the far-off whistle of a train. These were ordinary sounds, yet to the women inside they felt like proof of something extraordinary, that life could continue without fear, that equality was not only an idea, but a living rhythm in the air. As the lights flickered out, one of the women whispered a line from her diary. "The war had taken our freedom, but captivity showed us what freedom looks like." And soon they would see that this strange equality did not stop at city streets or offices. It reached into the fields and the factories, places where American women's hands had built the engines of victory. What waited beyond the town would change the prisoners' understanding of work, power, and pride forever. The next weeks took the prisoners deeper into the countryside. The landscape changed from gray towns to open plains. endless fields, and quiet barns painted red. Their camp was built near farmland, where they were assigned to work during the day. Most of them had never touched farm tools before. In Germany, such labor was considered men's work. But here, that rule seemed to have vanished. On their first morning, the women were led to a field where tractors growled across rows of corn. A tall American woman jumped down from one of the machines, wiping sweat from her brow. Her overalls were stained with oil. Her sleeves rolled high. She waved to the soldiers and shouted, "These ones can help by noon if they're cleared." The men nodded and followed her lead. The German women stared. The woman was not a supervisor. She was a farmer, commanding both men and machines with complete confidence. Her name, they later learned, was Helen Turner, owner of 200 acres of land. During the war, her husband had been drafted, leaving her to manage everything alone. She wasn't unique. Across America, thousands of women had stepped into similar roles. By 1945, nearly 3 million women worked on farms under the Women's Land Army program, replacing men sent to battlefields overseas. The prisoners worked beside Helen for several days. She spoke kindly, teaching them how to handle shovels and tie bundles. "The land doesn't care who plows it," she told them one afternoon, glancing at the horizon. "Only that it's done right." The sentence lingered in their minds long after she left. It was simple, but powerful. Work measured by effort, not by gender. In the evenings, when the prisoners returned to camp, they passed small factories where the windows glowed with light even after sunset. Through the open doors, they saw women bending over machines, drilling parts, stitching uniforms, and loading crates. The clang of metal echoed in the night. The smell of oil and sawdust mixed with the crisp air. Ruth whispered, "They build weapons, not just polish them." In Germany, women had been praised for supporting the war, sewing, cooking, raising children, but they were rarely allowed near the engines of production. Here, American women did not wait for permission. They made the tools of war. Some drove trucks filled with supplies, others worked in ammunition plants. Every motion spoke of independence. One day, a Red Cross worker brought a newspaper to the camp. Its headline read, "Rosie the Riveter finishes her millionth plane part." Underneath was a photograph of a smiling woman flexing her arm, showing strength without apology. The caption celebrated the workers who had produced more than 300,000 aircraft and 86,000 tanks since 1941. For the German prisoners, the numbers were unbelievable. They had lived through shortages, ration cards, and hunger. Here was a nation that seemed to run on endless energy, and much of that energy came from women. During lunch breaks, the prisoners were sometimes allowed to rest near the field. The air smelled of earth and hay, and the wind carried the hum of tractors. The American women farmers shared cold lemonade, bread, and small talk. They didn't treat the prisoners with hate, only with cautious politeness. That kindness was more confusing than cruelty. One German woman, Marta, wrote later, "We thought strength belonged to men, but here, even their women stood taller than we did." These encounters began to plant quiet thoughts, seeds of doubt about everything they had been told. They started to question not just the war, but the structure of their society. If women could drive tractors, run farms, and build airplanes, what else had been a lie? The camp guards noticed the change. The prisoners grew calmer, more curious. Some began practicing English words, asking questions about machines, wages, and schools. A few even said they wanted to learn to type when they returned home. At night, the horizon glowed orange from factory furnaces, and the rhythmic beat of machinery carried across the dark field. The prisoners lay awake listening, imagining a world where work no longer defined worth by gender or class. In one diary, a line appeared. "America's women had oil on their hands and light in their eyes. It made us wonder what kind of freedom could grow from such work." That thought, both admiration and longing, would follow them for the rest of their captivity. But their education in this strange freedom was far from over. Inside the camp itself, another lesson was waiting, one not of machines and fields, but of dignity and humanity behind barbed wire. The camp where the German women lived looked ordinary from a distance. A few wooden barracks, tall fences, and a guard tower that caught the sunlight each morning. But life inside was far different from what they had imagined before. Capture back in Germany. Propaganda had warned that American camps were cruel, that prisoners would be starved or beaten. Yet here, the truth was the opposite. They slept in clean bunks with real mattresses. They were given soap, toothpaste, and proper meals. Not luxury, but enough to live with dignity. Breakfast was often oatmeal or eggs. Lunch included bread, beans, and meat. It shocked them. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they found rules, order, and a strange sense of calm. One of the prisoners, Greta, later wrote, "We were not treated like enemies, but like human beings. It confused us more than hatred would have." The guards were mostly young American soldiers, polite but firm. Some smiled when spoken to. Others kept their distance. There were clear rules: no insults, no violence, no unnecessary punishment. If a prisoner followed orders, she was treated with fairness. But what truly surprised them was the presence of women among the guards. American women served as clerks, nurses, translators, and even military police. They carried sidearms, issued orders, and signed official reports. The German women couldn't hide their amaze. "Women giving orders to men," whispered Ruth, "and they listen?" Yes, they did. In that camp, authority had no gender. Every week, Red Cross officers visited to inspect the living conditions. They recorded food portions, checked medical supplies, and allowed prisoners to send letters home. Each woman was issued a small identification card and a number. When someone got sick, a nurse came to treat her, sometimes an American, sometimes a volunteer from the nearby town. The paradox was almost painful. These women had served a country that believed in obedience and hierarchy, where kindness toward an enemy was weakness, yet their captors practiced fairness as a rule, not as mercy. The work inside the camp was steady. Some prisoners sewed uniforms or repaired clothing. Others helped in the camp kitchen or tended gardens behind the barracks. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air each afternoon. They were paid a few cents for their labor, which they could spend at the camp canteen, buying chocolate, stamps, or writing paper. At night, the prisoners gathered in small groups. They shared stories, read English books from the library, or listened to the radio. American music, swing, jazz, soft voices like Bing Crosby, drifted through the hallways. It was forbidden back home, but here it played freely. The rhythm felt like freedom itself. Once, a young American nurse named Carol helped bandage a prisoner's injured hand. The German woman thanked her and asked, "Why are you kind to us?" Carol replied softly, "Because war doesn't cancel humanity." That sentence stayed with them for years. By early 1946, news of Germany's collapse reached the camp. Some prisoners cried quietly. Others sat in silence, staring at the ground. The war that had defined their world was gone. The Reich had fallen. Its promises had turned to dust. The camp commandant called them together. He told them the United States would soon begin repatriation, returning them to Europe. But until then, they would continue their work and follow the rules. His voice was calm, almost fatherly. For many women, it was the first time authority had spoken without shouting. When spring came, the camp changed again. Flowers bloomed near the fences, birds nested on the guard towers. The prisoners were allowed to decorate their barracks, hang curtains, and plant small gardens. They painted old tin cans to hold flowers, simple colors, cheerful against the wooden walls. One of them said quietly, "It looks more like a school than a prison." And in many ways it was. The camp became a classroom of unexpected lessons, not just in English or farming, but in values, discipline without cruelty, order without fear, strength without hate. The greatest shock was realizing that their captors were not trying to break them. They were showing them a different way to live, one built on fairness, respect, and freedom. This revelation would grow stronger in the months to come as the prisoners stepped outside the fences and saw how ordinary American women lived, not under orders, but by choice. When the prisoners were first allowed to work outside the camp, many felt nervous. The idea of walking freely, even under guard, seemed strange. They were driven in trucks to nearby towns to help in kitchens, laundries, and farms. The fences disappeared behind them, replaced by open skies and the ordinary noise of American life, cars, children's laughter, and church bells. For the first time, they saw how ordinary women lived in this new country, and what they saw surprised them more than any military secret. In one town, a prisoner named Erica worked at a bakery owned by Mrs. Lewis, a woman in her 50s with flour on her hands and confidence in her voice. She ran her business, managed staff, and spoke with customers like a leader. Her husband helped, but she made the decisions. When Erica asked, "Who owns this bakery?" Mrs. Lewis smiled and said simply, "I do." That small answer carried a quiet shock. Back home, women rarely owned anything in their own name. In Nazi Germany, they were told their duty was to serve as wives, mothers, and helpers. Here, women earned their own money and respect. Across America, in 1945, More than 6 million women worked in civilian jobs. Some were secretaries or teachers, others engineers, welders, or drivers. Many had filled roles left empty by soldiers at war. And even now that peace had come, they continued to work, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. In the afternoons, the prisoners helped with laundry at a hospital. American nurses walked the halls with purpose, giving orders to male orderlies and caring for soldiers without fear. One nurse, Lieutenant Adams, spoke to a German prisoner named Marta. "Back home," Marta said quietly, "a woman in uniform would be laughed at." But the nurse smiled. Here, she'd just be promoted. That conversation echoed through the prisoner's mind. Every day brought a new example of equality. Women driving cars, teaching in schools, managing stores. They saw mothers walking alone in public without shame, girls going to college, and women speaking in meetings without asking permission. In the evenings when they returned to camp, they talked about these things in whispers. "Do you think Germany will ever allow this?" one asked. "After what I've seen, how could we go back to the old ways?" another replied. Freedom was not a theory anymore. It was something they could see, hear, and touch. In the sound of factory whistles, in a woman's confident voice, in the laughter of girls who didn't know fear. One Sunday, a group of townspeople invited the prisoners to attend a church service. Inside, the pews were filled with families. Women sang in the choir, played the organ, and stood beside the pastor. One woman even delivered a short speech about helping refugees in Europe. The German prisoners exchanged silent glances. In Germany, church leadership had always been a man's duty. Here, women's voices filled the room. After the service, a local woman named Grace offered coffee and cake to the visitors. She spoke gently, asking about their families. "When the war ends for you," she said, "I hope you remember that kindness is stronger than fear." Those words, simple and sincere, felt heavier than any command. For many prisoners, it was the first time they felt respected as individuals, not as enemies or symbols of shame. Some of them began keeping diaries again. In one, a woman wrote, "In America, women walk like they belong to the world. I wonder if we ever will." Weeks turned into months. The prisoners continued to work and their English improved. They learned new skills, baking, typing, sewing, even driving tractors. But what changed most was not their work. It was their minds. They began to understand that power did not always mean control. Sometimes it meant the ability to choose your own path. The realization came back. But the Americans insisted. "You work with us," they said. "You eat with us." So they did, sitting at tables filled with roast meat, corn, and apple pie. The food was delicious, but the feeling of equality was even more powerful. In one home, the family listened to the radio together each night. The news talked about rebuilding Europe and helping former enemies. Then came music, soft jazz and swing melodies. The children danced, and one of the prisoners smiled for the first time in years. Later, she wrote in her diary, "This country fights with bombs, but it heals with kindness." The women began to realize that the real strength of America wasn't just its weapons or factories. It was the freedom people lived by. Freedom inside homes, between husbands and wives, parents and children. Every experience chipped away at the lies they had been told. That democracy was chaos. That freedom made people selfish. What they saw instead was order built on respect, not fear. When Sunday came, many of the families invited them to church picnics. There was laughter, games, and songs under the trees. American women spoke proudly about their plans, returning to college, starting a small business, joining community groups. Their confidence seemed to light up everything around them. One prisoner, Ruth, whispered to her friend, "They live as if life belongs to them." It was a simple line, but it carried deep truth. These women were not waiting for permission from anyone, not from men, not from governments, not from fear. When the German women returned to camp that evening, they sat quietly in their bunks. The noise of the day faded, but the images stayed. Women driving cars, running homes, raising voices, and still smiling with grace. It was not arrogance. It was freedom lived naturally. That night, one of them wrote in her diary, "We thought we were the chosen ones, but here everyone seems chosen by life itself." They were no longer looking at America as prisoners. They were looking at it as students of a new world, one where equality wasn't an idea, but a habit. And soon, they would have to face the question that frightened them most. What would they do with that knowledge when they returned to the ruins of Germany? By late 1946, the war felt far away. The fences around the camp still stood, but they no longer felt like barriers. The German women knew their time in America was ending. Soon they would be sent back to a broken homeland. Some felt relief, others fear. They had changed, quietly, deeply, and they wondered if their own country would understand what they had seen. The Red Cross began preparing lists for repatriation. Each prisoner received a small envelope with her name, a train ticket, and instructions for the journey home. But before leaving, they were allowed one last visit outside the camp, a farewell picnic arranged by local townspeople. It was a bright, windy afternoon. Long tables stood under oak trees, covered with food. It was both inspiring and painful, because it showed how much they had been denied back home. When they looked at American women, they saw a mirror, not of what they were, but what they could have been. And as summer drew near, that realization would become even clearer when they were invited into American homes, where freedom lived not in speeches, but in daily life. The next stage of their work brought the German prisoners into American homes. It was part of a goodwill program. Trusted POWs were allowed to help local families with chores and housework. For many women, it was the first time they stepped inside a private American household. What they found there changed their understanding of the world even more. The first thing they noticed was the comfort. The houses were warm, filled with light and simple beauty. Curtains of soft colors, photographs on walls, and the smell of coffee and bread. There was no fear here, no loud commands or cold silence. Families spoke gently to one another. Children laughed freely. The German women had not seen such peace in years. Helga, one of the younger prisoners, worked for a teacher named Mrs. Parker. She expected to be treated like a servant, but instead, Mrs. Parker handed her an apron and said, "We'll do this together." They washed dishes side by side, talked about the weather, and even shared stories about childhood. When Helga asked where Mr. Parker was, she learned that he was away studying to become a doctor, something she never expected from a man whose wife already worked full-time. "Do you mean your husband studies while you teach?" Helga asked in disbelief. Mrs. Parker smiled. "Yes, why not? We both have dreams." That small moment captured the heart of the difference. In Germany, women's dreams were often limited to family and obedience. In America, they were something to be shared, equal parts of a life built together. The German prisoners saw women driving cars to markets, managing family accounts, and speaking openly at dinner table. They were not silent when men spoke. They disagreed, laughed, and even teased their husbands. It was freedom expressed not in speeches but in daily behavior. At one house, a farmer's wife named Nora showed two prisoners how to use a washing machine. "It saves me hours every week," she said proudly. "More time for reading." That sentence left them stunned. In wartime Germany, books had been censored, especially for women. Here reading was a symbol of independence, not rebellion. During meals, the German women were often invited to sit and eat with the families. At first, they refused, old habits of hierarchy and fear holding the sandwiches, pies, and lemonade. American women and former prisoners sat side by side, eating and talking like old friends. There were no guards with guns this time, only polite soldiers keeping order in the distance. Ruth, one of the older prisoners, spoke with a teacher she had met months earlier. "When I came here," she said softly, "I thought you would hate us. Instead, you showed us how to live." The teacher smiled gently. "Freedom doesn't work through hate," she replied. "It grows through choice." That word, choice, stayed in Ruth's mind. In Germany, choice had disappeared long before the war began. People were told what to think, whom to follow, and how to live. Here she had seen the opposite, a society full of movement, ideas, and second chances. As the afternoon sun lowered, some of the American women gave small gifts, scarves, photographs, notebooks. "Something to remember us by," they said. One notebook carried a short message: "Be brave enough to be free." That night, the prisoners packed their few belongings. The camp that once felt like a cage now seemed like a school they were graduating from. The sound of the wind through the fences reminded them of the world waiting beyond. The next morning, buses carried them to the port. As they passed through towns, people waved politely. Children smiled. The women watched factories, farms, and schools roll by, all places where they had seen women working with pride and confidence. At the harbor, they saw ships loading supplies for Europe. One American officer told them that thousands of tons of food, tools, and medicine were being sent overseas to help rebuild, even for our former enemies, he said. The German women looked at one another. Mercy, too, was freedom's strength. During the long voyage home, the women shared memories, their first American meal, the women farmers, the kind nurse, the families who welcomed them. They realized they were no longer the same people who had arrived in fear and anger. America had not lectured them, it had shown them another way of living. When they finally reached Germany, the contrast was painful. Cities lay in ruins, streets filled with rubble, food was scarce, hope even rarer. Yet, in that grayness, the women carried something new, a quiet belief that life could be different. Some became teachers, nurses, or writers. A few joined early movements for women's rights in post-war Germany. They remembered what they had seen in America. Women standing tall, earning respect and living without shame. In later years, one former prisoner wrote, "I learned that freedom is not a gift given by men in power. It is a habit of the heart, practiced every day." That thought became the invisible link between two worlds once divided by war. They had come to America as soldiers of a fallen cause. They left as witnesses to a living idea that equality could build stronger nations than conquest ever could. The paradox of their story was complete. The country that defeated them had also taught them how to rebuild themselves. And, as one of them wrote before leaving the camp, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its belief that dignity belongs to everyone.